Hello. So, what we're going to talk about here is the commercial revolution, which is sort of loosely defined as economic changes that Europe went through during the early modern era, sort of the creation of a capitalistic economy and a transition from a town-centered way of life and economic system to a national sense of economy. So instead of thinking just in the old medieval sort of way about your manor and what would be traded right near you, you might start to think more about the nation of France and what economics would look like for you. So there's two basic underpinnings that lead to the commercial revolution: a rise in population. So population sort of grows rapidly during the 1500s, grows 20 million people just in the 1500s. It increases all over. England increases 5 million people during this time. France increases to a population of 20 million during this time. The German states also are going to have an enormous boost during this time. Russia is growing. Italy and Spain a little bit less, but they're growing as well. So there's sort of, I guess we're kind of catching up from where we were with the plague, and even going beyond that. Cities are growing. So this is a picture right here of London, Paris, becoming cities of over 200,000 people, which for that time is pretty big. Antwerp, Lisbon, Seville, around 100,000 people. Most of this population increase actually isn't in cities. It's just that the rural regions of Europe are becoming more dense and more densely populated. So this is one of the reasons that there's kind of going to be some change in economy. Is just the amount of people that are there. There's a growing market. Second reason is something that's often referred to as the price revolution. And what this sort of is slow, very slow inflation that takes place over the years. So what you can see in this top, I can't make that big. If you can see in this top graph, what this is showing is from 1300 to 1600 the consumer prices in European cities, and you can see in the 1500s going towards the 1600s sort of a gradual sort of rise in prices during this time. You can also kind of see during this time real wages, which I guess talks about like standard of living and how far your money would go. And you can kind of see this stuff in this second graph here. So the question is why? Why do prices change? Why is there inflation during this period? And one of them is simply there's an increased demand for food. So there's more land that's being farmed, but a lot of it is land that's really difficult to farm. And so the production cost to farm that land is more difficult than before, and so agricultural prices go up. In the 1500s alone, England's agricultural prices actually quadrupled. There's also a second reason for the inflation is there's just an increased volume of money. One of the strategies that royalty used during this time period was to debase currency. Basically, when they couldn't pay their bills, they just changed the currency, and obviously that leads to inflation. And there's going to be a problem in places like Spain in particular. And second, because of the new sort of age of exploration, there's a lot of gold and silver that's being brought into Europe. And so because of that, there's sort of a natural, money becomes worth less. So population increase and trade, the growth of trade during this time, the growth of cities actually sort of checks inflation a little bit. The long trend during this time is that prices are sort of going up. And this affects everything. It affects everything you would buy, but it also affects the cost of rent, of land, the effect of labor, all that kind of stuff. So the result of this is what we call, and this is actually, just to add on to this, you could talk about this time in the 1500s here, right in the middle, sort of price revolution. And you could make the argument that inflation is caused by an influx of goods from the Americas. So this is measuring the price of wheat and silver during this time period, and it's all potentially related to money coming in from the Americas. I don't know how good of an argument that is, but it is an argument some people make. So all that leads to what we call the commercial revolution, time period of rising prices, growing population, and a lot more economic opportunities than there had been in previous times. As I said earlier, this is roughly in the neighborhood of 1300 to 1800, so it's a broad period, doesn't happen overnight, but there's more customers, stocks begin to exist and rise in value. You can borrow money more easily, and borrowed money could be more easily repaid, which lends itself to then people lending out more money. Governments are going to actually benefit from this. There's more people paying taxes, more people who could potentially be soldiers. So this is sort of a long and protracted revolution, but nonetheless it's a revolution. So you can see in this picture right here, you can see a picture of moneylenders painting, bankers, earliest bankers. Remember we talked about the Fugger family, obviously the Medici family in Italy. Here we have a picture of a map of, moving the wrong thing here. Map of the world as exploration's growing, and this is actually a joint stock charter. So joint stock companies are coming into being, which are fairly profitable. So another way of thinking about this is from an old project someone did, commercial revolution. You can see, up here, what ends up happening is there's more money available, banking, more credit, paper money, stuff like that, which does help lead to the rise of capitalism. See, like joint stock companies down there, private ownership of goods, people reinvesting money that they make, things like that. There's more trade available and trade routes because of exploration. So now more goods are being, exchanged and things like that, which leads to changes in social classes and whatnot. So this is sort of all part of what we kind of define the commercial revolution as. To think about it, and I want us to pay particular attention to sort of this side of the chart. An easy way to think about this is in comparison with the Middle Ages. So this feudal system right here, to the very left, give it like a little star here. This is obviously the medieval system. So in this system, the basic economic unit of people in Europe was their town and the adjoining countryside. You had craftsmen who typically were in guilds who produced items for that town and that countryside area that they would use. Peasants obviously produced food. They would sell that to the town, and then they would buy the items from those craftsmen in those guilds. The towns themselves would enforce tariffs and other regulations to protect their economy. They didn't want you trying to buy stuff from other markets. So other vendors, other people trying to sell their goods were very much taxed. The craftsmen, you can make the argument, in these guilds actually owned all of the capital. So they had the house, the workshop area. They owned all the tools, all the materials, and they acted as labor. And so they really produced only upon order. There's not a lot of profit here, but there's also not much risk and not much innovation. You tell them what you want, and they'll make it for you. And their margins are not incredibly wide, but they can make something. So as we get into the 1500s or so, we kind of enter what we call this proto-industrial sort of system. This is proto, kind of meaning like pre-industrial sort of system, where things begin to be traded over a wider, area. One of the problems with this feudal system was that there was a lack of capital for mass production, and a lack of knowledge from people over what people would want in distant areas. That's going to change with this sort of new system that we're going to be moving into. So what ends up happening, new entrepreneurs emerge. Mostly the entrepreneurs are involved in banking. Again, think of the Medici family, think of the Fugger family. And essentially what they do is they become very wealthy, they have a lot of money, and so they finance things and they make money, and then they just sort of are thinking about how they can make more money. And so out of this, they decide to kind of create a new system of doing things. And this system is called putting out, which is sort of a strange way of strange thing to call this. But sometimes it's called the cottage industry. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as the domestic system. But it's a really simple system, and these two pictures sort of illustrate it. You can see these are people working in their homes. And that's sort of what happened. Entrepreneurs would seek to kind of evade the restrictive practices of the guilds, get around town guilds. So what they would do is they go out to the countryside where people were looking for extra work, where people wanted to make a little bit extra money, and they would provide them everything they needed. So you can see in this, early like spinning wheels and things like that. This is a little more complex machine up here, but they would provide them with all that necessary equipment, and the women predominantly would spin wool. The entrepreneur would even supply the wool. The women would spin that into thread, and then the men would weave that into cloth. And so then basically at the end of the week, the entrepreneur would come back, and whatever you produced, whatever cloth you produced, he would buy from you. And so it's in your best interest to produce as much as possible, and the entrepreneur obviously would make money off of this. He would go sell it at some other town at a marked up price. This actually hurts guilds, because while guilds can guarantee quality, they charge higher prices. And so it actually also sort of signifies a broader splitting of capital and labor. Previously, as we talked about in the guild, the craftsman owned everything. He was one-stop shop. Well, now you've got this sort of boss, the entrepreneur, who comes and sort of dictates what you do, and he pays you wages. And most of these people who are now labor, they work only when the entrepreneur offers them work. They're paid by the job, and they really don't care about anything other than finishing a piece of cloth and giving it to the entrepreneur. And so there's kind of a shift here and a division of capital and labor, which is kind of interesting. So out of this, we can even look here at some pros and cons of cottage industry we're putting out. Pros: helps farmers supplement income, creates some entrepreneurs, new consumer goods, work can be done at home, but it's also sort of inefficient. Labor's all over the place. There's still somewhat of a lack of capital. So out of this, new industries are going to emerge in the 1400s and 1500s. They don't fit into the guild framework. So like mining, printing, the book trade, shipbuilding, weapons manufacturing, none of these things fit into a traditional model that the guilds had sort of used. There's now international markets that are developing. No guild craftsmen could afford the cost of this kind of thing. And so even the guilds have to borrow from capitalists. New banking practices emerge to get the capital necessary to finance all this stuff. Lending is going to have to increase, and so lending with interest is going to emerge. Lending with interest had long been frowned upon in Christian society. Even to the 1600s, people frowned upon it. It was a practice that many Jews used, and one of the reasons why people persecuted them. But by the 1600s, most people who are lending money, Christians, Jewish, everybody is charging interest on those loans. The church tries to forbid it, but the practice continues. And as time goes on, people get used to it, and now they push for sort of reasonable interest rates instead of pushing for no interest rates. And so the sort of final outcome of all this is the development of a new economic system. And it's not quite capitalism yet, but it's going to be called mercantilism. And you've probably heard of this concept, but the goal of mercantilism is to be completely self-sufficient as a country. So pay particular attention to this. They talk a lot in mercantilism about having a favorable balance of trade, which basically means you want more exports and fewer imports. The theory goes that there's a finite amount of gold in the world, and what we want to do as a country is we want to have all the gold. And so if we are importing a lot of things, what we're actually doing is we're giving away our gold. If we're exporting a lot of things, we can start hoarding the gold, and we can start building up our treasury, our national treasury. And so we want to be totally self-sufficient. as countries. Obviously, something that can help this is colonies. And so when exploration grows, colonies become something that can bring obviously gold and silver in, but other materials as well, gold, silver, fur, lumber, all that kind of stuff. Then we can sort of turn that into manufactured goods, sell them back to our colonies, and we can obviously reap the benefit. You can see down here, obviously, think about like the Columbian Exchange. You can see goods coming to Europe from North America, all of which become somewhat productive. Might be something to think about. I don't know. You can kind of look at this, pause this at a later time if you want to. Advantages and disadvantages of mercantilism. Kind of interesting. Now, this obviously focuses on Great Britain, and you can kind of contrast why it's good for Great Britain as sort of the mother country, and then why it might be good for the colonies or not so good for the colonies. I think what it symbolizes is that the countries of Europe kind of want, they see now each other as rivals, more so than they even had before, especially as sort of colonialism is growing. And they recognize that if I don't get colonies, someone else will. And if someone else gets colonies, they're going to benefit from all that influx of raw materials and goods and things like that. And so even within these countries, they begin to want everyone to work. And they want to do whatever they can do to rise their exports and lower their imports. So how do we rise exports? How do we build up our economy? Well, we're going to actually give tax benefits and different favors. Think of like subsidies to merchants who provide jobs for a lot of people. Or if you're going to start developing, I don't know, guns or anything we would want you to develop, we'll give you a subsidy. We'll give you a tax break. And that actually builds up those industries so that we can produce more things and sell more things. Now, on the flip side, how do we lower imports? It's fairly simple. What we try and do is we just put tariffs on things. And here's a basic graph kind of illustrating how tariffs work, but it's basically just a tax on any import. So it's just not worth buying imported material because it's just too expensive. So what's the sort of impact of all this? One of the impacts of this is that it's going to begin to shift that mindset from towns to nations in terms of what we think of our economy. We start to look to kings and queens to provide for us and to give us direction, whereas before we'd looked at guilds. And from this point on, guilds are really, really going to decline to the point where they're sort of irrelevant. Governments are now encouraging new industries. If we talked about national markets are created, because what governments want, they're happy to have free trade within their country. Okay, so there previously had been all these internal tariffs, as we talked about, between different towns. Now we do away with all of those things and try and encourage trade amongst ourselves and just have national tariffs. And joint stock companies obviously are going to grow because trade in distant lands is profitable, but it's too sort of risky for any one person to do. Most famous joint stock company would be the Dutch East India Company. There's an English East India Company. There's a bunch of them. They grow, and the state supports it because it's beneficial to the state. And all of this stuff sort of changes the economic mindset of Europe during this time, and it's something that we should be aware of. You could argue that one of the impacts of this is, we'll go back to